so excited you could join us for this first ever live research talk hosted by NAF's Research and Tech Department. If you don't know me, if we've never met, my name's Nick Minar. I'm Director of Research and Reporting at NAF, and it's my distinct pleasure to kick off this first research talk and what we hope is going to be an ongoing series going forward. We hope this series is going to be, provide a unique opportunity to our staff and to our network as a place where we can hear from experts in the field conducting research on many important areas of scholarship, covering important topics such as, but definitely not limited to, things like career and technical education, work-based learning, equitable access to education, education policy, college access and completion, workforce development, and of course STEM education. We're really thrilled to have you here today, and thank you again for your time and for attending. Before we begin, I want to just have two quick announcements on some light housekeeping issues. As you know, during the COVID-19 pandemic, everyone is working from home and using their internet to a much greater degree. Now, I have taken precautions today against my connection being disrupted, but in the unlikely event that this does happen, it is likely that the stream will go offline and it'll be very difficult to relaunch. But should this happen, our speaker, Dr. Dougherty, has agreed to record his talk offline, and then we will post it after the fact. I mean, the timeline may be a little disrupted on when that happens, but just know if for some reason we go offline, we'll get the content out eventually. That is a natural and seamless transition to where this talk is going to be posted, which would, among many places, actually be our NAF Research and LinkedIn Tech page. Now, if you're not already familiar with this page, this is run by the Research and Tech Department, and you can just search Research and Tech NAF on LinkedIn, and you'll be brought right to that page. If you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to check it out. And like I said, this will be one of the destinations where our talk will be posted after the fact. We're regularly posting interesting articles and all different kinds of resources related to the education research space. So again, we're hoping we won't be disrupted on this particular talk here today, but keep your fingers crossed. Okay. Now, it's my unique pleasure to bring on Dr. Dougherty here, who's our speaker today, and let's be honest, the real reason why everyone is tuning in today. Dr. Dougherty holds a Ph.D. in quantitative policy analysis from Harvard University and is an associate professor of public policy and education at Vanderbilt University's Peabody College of Education and Human Development. His research and teaching interests focus on education policy, causal program evaluation and cost analysis, the economics of education, with a very heavy emphasis on career and technical education. In particular, Dr. Dougherty's work emphasizes how education can address human capital development, as well as issues of equity related to things like race, class, gender, and disability. Currently, Dr. Dougherty is a PI or a co-PI on 3 IES-funded projects that analyze the effects of high school CTE on student outcomes. And he's also a co-PI on a policy research lab called the CTE Exchange. And this particular lab uses state longitudinal data systems to create standardized and generalizable approaches to analyzing CTE data through state systems. Just as a quick aside, Dr. Dougherty's connection to CTE began through his work as a high school mathematics teacher and then also an assistant principal. And just as another aside, I met Dr. Dougherty maybe last December at the Association for Career and Technical Education in the research conference, where he was actually one of the keynote speakers. And more or less the whole time he was giving his talk, I kept thinking to myself, this is someone the NAF network and the NAF family really needs to know about. And I'm absolutely thrilled he accepted my invitation to speak with all of you today. So I encourage you, as he's giving this talk, to pose questions in the chat. We'll be addressing those at the end of the stream here for about a 20-minute Q&A. Without further ado, I'd like to bring on Dr. Shaun Dougherty. Let me get off the screen here and get you on the screen. Can you check to make sure your camera's connected again, Shaun? Oh, there you are. Yes.
Yeah.
And I will be showing your slides here. So yes, without further ado, here is Dr. Shaun Dougherty.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much, Nick, for the invitation, for hosting me, and to all the folks who making time to join. I hope to make good use of your time and share some ongoing work of my own and sort of give my take on what are the challenges to conducting research related to career and technical education, and then paint a picture of where I think there are opportunities to move forward with the research. So it seems like the slides are now in the feed, and so.
Yeah, sorry, I'm having trouble adding you to the feed, but I will try to do that as you are giving your talk.
No, I'll dive right in. Everyone at least got a glimpse of my currently disheveled state after 5 months in quarantine in Nashville, Tennessee. All right, so the title that I gave the talk was just recent evidence in career and technical education research. This will certainly not be all of the evidence, but I'm going to emphasize research evidence that can support causal inference. I may not be able to advance my slides. Let's see. Oh, there we go. All right. So as I said, the goals for this hour will be to highlight some challenges and opportunities related to career and technical education research. That's all right. It went. I'll keep talking. I'm going to discuss some research network efforts. The CTE Research Network that IES has funded, and that Nick mentioned, the CTE Policy Exchange, or CTEX, and then also I'll highlight the MDRC Center for Effective CTE is doing a number of high quality studies, and by no means are these the only groups that are engaged in CTE research or trying to aggregate them, but there are a few of the more recent efforts or revived efforts, broader, inclusive of those efforts, and then also a bit broader. I'll share some recent research on the impacts of CTE, primarily high school CTE and secondary education, though I assume that was going to be more the interest for this audience, though certainly there's a rich tradition of understanding post-secondary CTE as well. And then I'll talk a little bit about what I think are some fruitful future avenues for research, again with the focus on opportunities that can support causal inference, as well as data sets that might be ripe for rich descriptive work, which I think probably is particular interest to the NAF audience, in part because you have so many partner schools. I think there's a lot of opportunity to link data from those partner schools with state longitudinal data systems, and get some more insights into how school programs are operating, what are possible impacts associated with those programs, and then even looking at the heterogeneity, the extent to which the experiences and outcomes might vary across settings. So kind of do a quick broad brush painting of the current context. Nationwide, most CTE instruction and experiences are happening in comprehensive high schools. And by that, I just mean kind of prototypical residentially assigned high schools, students in classes of between 50 graduating seniors up to 1,500 realistically nationwide. Other places that CTE in high school takes place are in technical centers. I think this is the most common model outside of comprehensive high schools nationally, where students leave their assigned high school for part of the day and attend a technical center where there's specialized equipment, small group instruction, and access to different programs that might be available than in their own comprehensive high school. And the challenge is most CTE instruction is happening in these two settings, but in most instances there's no, well, I can't think of a single study that can support causal inference from those settings. And so the challenge is, folks don't sort randomly into CTE, and in most instances comprehensive high schools don't have programs that are oversubscribed or some random or quasi-random factor that sort of sorts some students in and not others. And so it's really hard to learn about the impacts in those environments. And the key, I think, element to why this matters is the first bullet point here, which is that the folks who choose CTE typically are fundamentally different than those who don't. And even if they're similar on a lot of other observable characteristics, there's often something in the administrative data that we don't observe about them that explains why they chose to pursue electrical work, whereas some other student that looked very similar did not. And there's also limited opportunities to do random assignment because students have different interests and are trying to develop those interests in high school. It doesn't make much sense for us to take a group of 100 students and randomize half of them to a plumbing pathway and the other half to a cosmetology pathway, and then maybe a third group to neither, and see how those experiences impact students, because presumably there'd be some sort of adverse impact to anyone who didn't want to do that. So we I think as a field and as educators have pretty strong beliefs about maybe who CTE would most benefit, and we don't all have the same definition, but we have some maybe descriptive evidence that sort of aligns with our prior beliefs, and then impacts how we think about designing educational programs or how we emphasize access to educational programs, where we locate programs, where we don't. But the fact is, we still know relatively little about what works for whom, and then certainly not why. And so that's really at the focus of a lot of the work that I've been trying to do. And as Nick mentioned at the top of the hour, part of my motivation for doing this is because I was a high school math teacher for 5 years, and I was a high school assistant principal for 2 years after that. And in that work, I taught students who attended the local technical center outside of, near my high school outside of Philadelphia. I also was a liaison to that technical center as an administrator, and I saw that students were very engaged in the work that they were doing. But I also, and I saw that to me, at least anecdotally, it seemed like the students that were engaged in the technical center were having more positive and rewarding experiences than some other students that were not attending that center. And so it sort of led me to want to understand and unpack the answers to some of these questions. So, of late, I'll just, the 1 minute version of this, I think is that as we have had evidence that the sort of college for all model that was pursued for 15 or 20 years was not yielding exactly the results that were intended, there was sort of increasing appreciation that differentiated pathways to post-secondary life make sense. In fact, they're necessary to ensure that folks get the right training to align with pathways that interest them, that are financially or otherwise feasible. And so then increasingly policy has followed that. The federal accountability policies have shifted towards college and career readiness as opposed to just college for all. And then the Perkins reauthorization, federal law that helps fund career and technical education at the national level has also been reauthorized recently and shifted in ways that reflect changes in career and technical education, changes in the sort of workforce, the national labor market, so CTE is back in a high salience area, which to me just means it's that much more important that we are pursuing evidence to inform these policies, update these policies, so that as individuals and policymakers are focused on these efforts, that we we make the policies as close to supporting what we know is effective as possible. So with that context set, I'll just say there's a few efforts of which I'm lucky to be a part that are aligned and focused on pursuing this. The CTE Research Network. This is kind of a card that we, if you've been at any meetings where the network has attended, we've got like a cardstock version of this to hand out. But there's the website. There's a Twitter handle and a LinkedIn page, depending on how you're connected to social media. But if you just want to sign up and make sure that you get notified about the latest research findings that are posted on the network site, you can do that. And you can also go on the site and find out what the funded projects are. So these are all IES funded projects. The network itself is funded by the Institute of Education and Sciences as well. And the idea is we're trying to produce research, put research in conversation with one another, connect it to policy and practice, provide training, and do coordination of research findings and dissemination of findings in ways that are sort of making sure it's reaching all of the audiences that care. And so if you haven't heard about us previously, that means we've been missing a big audience in National Academy Foundation folks. So please let me know or go ahead and get yourself signed up. Sorry, I'm passing these slides too quickly. So here in just a little more detail are the goals of the research network. The training component, we're going to be offering our first summer training in just a few weeks. We actually, interest far exceeded our capacity, and so we will be repeating this possibly at AERA in 2021 if that happens face to face, and certainly again each summer for a number of summers. And the goal is to record some online versions of this as well. So if you're interested in learning more about how to conduct CTE research or reading more of the academic literature, that's how we've designed these trainings. And so again, feel free to use the network website or be in touch with me if that's useful. And then we're doing lots around facilitating collaboration across funded projects and other folks, including possibly some of you in the audience today who are doing IES funded CTE related research and sort of extending the conversation. So I'll also make sure, I know this is being taped and broadcast, but I'll also be sure to share the slides via Nick if that's of interest.
Absolutely.
Great. And so then just two more quick plugs. The CTE Policy Exchange, CTEX, is hosted at Georgia State University. Is currently a partnership between Georgia State, University of Tennessee at Knoxville, and Vanderbilt University. And we've been working in partnership with the states of Michigan, Massachusetts, and Tennessee for the last 3 or 4 years now. And we're in the process of expanding to include Washington State and the state of Montana, and interested in collecting other state partners where they have a lead researcher that works with them to leverage their state longitudinal data system to produce actionable research for the state. And then MDRC has had a focus on CTE for quite a long time, and they've sort of relaunched their Center on Effective Career and Technical Education and are also engaged in some phenomenal work and have great sets of resources that are publicly facing and available without a paywall if you're interested there. So having pointed you to some places where you can access this research, I just wanted to pivot and talk a little more about what we know from the limited cause and effect supporting research. So I'll just own here for a minute that there's lots of good research on career and technical education. Good in the sense that it's been very thoughtfully done. It describes the context in which CTE is happening in great detail, and it just provides the richest possible description based on the evidence, and in some instances, some pretty compelling associations. The challenge is, however, in most instances, there is not an experimental or quasi-experimental variation in who gets access to CTE. So as I mentioned probably 10 minutes ago now, it's the fact that there isn't any randomness in the assignment that means we can't say that this experience in CTE caused these outcomes. And so then it leaves us to wonder whether or not what we're observing in terms of differences in outcomes is really a function of the career and technical education experience, or something omitted that we don't observe that might explain those differences in outcomes. So the causal evidence is really limited to a pretty short list of studies, the most notable and long-standing of which is on career academies. And so you all may be very familiar with the MDRC study led by Jim Kempel that found, well, I'll go into detail in just a second, but 2008 was the last report from that study. And just recently, Hemelt, Leonard, and Paplo did a more recent evaluation of a single career academy in North Carolina, and they've got some contrasting findings that I'll unpack there. But that's sort of the causal evidence that we have on career academies in particular, which was some of the first on the causal evidence of CTE in general. We also have some evidence of a positive impact on high school completion from other models of CTE that I'll talk about in more detail in a second. There's some evidence on college going, though it's sort of mixed, where the overall evidence suggests that students who are in CTE in high school may be less likely to go to college, but for those that do engage in CTE in college, there's evidence of positive returns to those investments in the way of short and long certificates. And then the greatest amount of evidence and the clearest, and by clearest I mean like least ambiguous in terms of findings, is of positive effects on workforce outcomes. Both likelihood of being employed as well as earnings while employed are higher among CTE participants. And so, despite the limited causal evidence, there is sort of, it's suggestive that this is positive, the impact of CTE, though it comes out of only a handful of settings at the moment. So I'll mention first a project that I'm a part of that's IES funded, part of the research network, and is based in Connecticut. It looks at whole school models of career and technical education, the Connecticut Technical High School system of 16 all CTE high schools located around the state, open to anyone in the state who would like to apply. And students who apply are ranked on application criteria and then admitted in descending order until they run out of seats. And it creates the opportunity to use a regression discontinuity research design to estimate the impact of students who are just near the cutoff, those who just barely got in compared to those who just missed getting in. And we find, looking across almost 10 graduating high school graduation cohorts, large positive effects on high school graduation, large positive effects on earnings and employment by age 23. We find a negative effect on initial college enrollment. Oh, excuse me. My 6-year-old decided to pop in and ask a question. Just a second. Excuse me 1 second.
Yeah, sure. I'll try to get you on the screen
Here.
as well while we do.
Go ask Mama. Okay, you gotta leave me alone because I'm in the middle of a presentation. Yes, that's fine. All right, I apologize. Parental miscommunication. We have two parents on broadcast calls at the same time. Thanks for allowing me to pause a second. I've lost my train of thought. On college impacts, negative effects on initial college enrollment, meaning students who went to these specialized CTE schools were less likely to go on to college immediately. But by age 23, we saw no difference in ever enrolling in college or the total semesters enrolled, which suggests to us that the initial college enrollment may not be as high, but that eventually students were enrolling in high school at roughly the same rate. The key thing to mention here for this study is that all of the impacts we found were for boys only. There were no impacts for girls. And some of this could be explained by the fact that the schools disproportionately serve males. About 60% of students enrolled are male. Another possible explanation is that for girls who didn't get into these schools, their outcomes are better on average. And so there was less room for improvement, but still we've got some more time and space to invest to really understand those clear gender differences. I'll just gonna skip past these slides for want of time, but this is some graphical evidence from that paper that shows these large positive effects on high school graduation and on earnings here. In the Kempel and Wilner study that I mentioned earlier, that this was this RCT where students were randomized into one of 9 career academies, or if they didn't get into the career academy via that lottery, they attended their sort of typical residentially assigned high school. And in that study, they found no impact on high school graduation or other learning outcomes, but there were really large positive effects on earnings 7 years after high school. So in that sense, and again, only for boys. So in that sense, the finding in Connecticut that I just mentioned, and this study from Kempel and Wilner that predates the data collection in Connecticut, show really clearly aligned findings of positive impacts on earnings, but only for boys. A clear difference between the two is that in Connecticut, we also find large impacts on graduation, though in the Kempel and Wilner study and these 9 career academies, the counterfactual outcomes were actually quite large for the students that did not get into the career academy. So I'm going to pause here just one second because I see a question asking about any differences in outcomes around ethnicity or socioeconomic groups. I don't recall in the Kempel and Wilner study, but in the Connecticut study, I'll just backtrack a second. We found that the effects held up for all possible subgroups of students. So students who were eligible for subsidized meals saw effects that were equally large to their higher income peers. We also saw, in particular for Black and Latino students who constitute a large proportion of the student population in Connecticut, that the effects were just as large for Black and Latino students as well. We were not able to look at students with disabilities because the application process works slightly differently for them, but we have a follow-up study planned in those instances. And then in terms of how students are spread across cities, suburbs, and rural areas, schools located across those 3 contexts, we saw that the results held up across all 3 of those as well. And so this was sort of a, the simplistic story maybe is that at least for boys, all boys that applied and got in seemed to benefit regardless of their other sociodemographic background. And then a recent update to the Career Academies literature, there's a long, rich literature on career academies, but in terms of the causal literature, it's really the MDRC study and then this study from Hemelt, Leonard, and Paplau that use data from Wake County Public Schools in North Carolina. They've been expanding their career academy presence over the last 20 years. And in fact, I'm naively coming into this talk not knowing kind of whether and how many might be NAF schools. But in any case, they've made this expansion and this one career academy has been around long enough and is oversubscribed and so has lottery-based admission. And they were able to use that lottery data to estimate the impacts of getting in. And in this, career academy that's still in existence and with recent cohorts, they were able to show large positive impacts on high school graduation, similar to what we find in Connecticut and analogous to what I found in a handful of schools in Massachusetts in a study that I'm not featuring any more prominently just mentioning it in passing. And they also found sort of null or unclear effects on college going and immediate earnings. And so, at least in terms of academic impacts, there's clear effect on graduation. And then they did see some impacts on test scores and 9th grade attendance, suggesting that there's sort of generalized learning benefits as well as possible benefits in the form of school engagement as measured by attendance. And then lastly, but by no means the only additional study going on, but again, just in the last couple of years, causal evidence on the impacts of CTE. Charday Bonilla studied the impact of competitive grant funding to expand CTE offerings in the state of California. Basically, every district that wanted to applied, laying out their plan for using the money, and their applications were ranked. And they sort of awarded the competitive funding to all the top ranked programs. And so again, she uses this regression discontinuity design where she compares the districts that just barely got the money based on their rank to the districts that just missed getting the money based on their rank, and compares the outcomes. And she finds a few things that are really, I think, important. It's one, that when districts won the money, they actually spent it on expanding their CTE offerings, which was the intent, but there's plenty of literature in public administration and public policy to suggest that money is not always spent as intended. And then the second is that there was a reduction in dropout. So I'd say that's analogous to some of the other studies finding increases in high school graduation. And in contrast to the MDRC study of career academies and my work in Connecticut, she finds larger impacts for girls, and speculates that one of the mechanisms might be that a lot of the expansion that took place in California was in health service professions, which tend to be female dominated, but which also align with the labor market demand in the state of California. So let me pause there. I see that there's another question that's popped in, and if it's related to this, I want to try and keep answering these in a timely manner.
Yeah, so the question that's in there now is from a member of our staff, and he was asking the results that typically come out, because CTE encompasses multiple different content areas, do studies typically split apart those content areas in the results?
So I'm in the midst of doing just that with working with one of my Ph.D. students at Vanderbilt, Walter Ecton. I will have a working paper to share pretty soon. But exactly to your point, we've sort of gotten tired of this sort of monolithic treatment of CTE because, as you suggest, we might expect very different outcomes from an IT program compared to a hospitality program, compared to a plumbing or HVAC program. And it's because those programs don't necessarily serve the same students. They don't necessarily have the same pathways into post-secondary education or the workforce. It's important to really understand those differences. The short answer, though, to your question, so more to come on that quite soon, we hope. But the short answer is no, studies don't typically do this, and largely for reasons that are connected to either data limitations or statistical power. So for instance, in Connecticut, we don't yet have, though we will for the next 5-year study, be getting access to what pathways or programs of study a student pursued. And that's common in a lot of these studies, is we sort of know who is a concentrator or who attended a specialized high school. And so the treatment is this like, whole school, or winning a lottery, or getting access to career academies, even though we know, let's say in a school, there were 4 different academies that you might have had to choose from. And the reason that studies don't typically do that is either 1, we don't have the specific student level information, or 2, we don't have enough statistical power to split out, let's say 16 different programs across 1,000 students. The groups would become so small, we wouldn't be able to detect the effects for those individual students. And then the last consideration is, at least in these quasi-experimental studies, students are getting randomized into whole schools. And then once they're in the school, then they're making choices, more informed choices about what program of study to pursue. And once they're making those choices are no longer random. They reflect student interest or other information that they've gotten. And so they don't necessarily carry the same causal warrants for interpretation. That said, there's a lot to be learned from trying to understand these different choices and pathways, and so that's what Walt and I have been, or I've been working on with Walt. He's been taking the lead, and so if you're interested, I'm happy once we make that a working paper to share that.
Excellent. Thank you.
Great. Sure thing. Thanks, Nick, for facilitating. So sort of to that point, this is just a picture, a figure from a paper of mine with Isabel McDonald, where we looked at Massachusetts administrative data over a decade to see how program offering has shifted over time. And so you can see on the vertical axis, this is the percentage of schools offering programs of study in sort of three broad areas: information technology, health services, and manufacturing technology and engineering. And two things to point out is, one, manufacturing technology and engineering and health services have been offered at a very high level statewide in Massachusetts for a long time, whereas IT has been growing quite rapidly, or grew quite rapidly over the first decade of the 21st century. And I think that this reflects broader trends in career and technical education nationally, such that programs are trying to align offerings with national workforce demand, and then starting to reconfigure what programs are offered in their schools in ways that are meant to align with that demand. But it also means that it's changing some of the post-secondary pathways, and then likely some of the conversation and policy that should be happening locally to support that. And so this is just to kind of hammer that point home a little bit further. On the left-hand side, this is another figure from the same study. On the left-hand side, you have student-level enrollment in STEM and non-STEM programs over time. So the orange is non-STEM enrollment, the green is STEM enrollment, and then on the right-hand axis, corresponding to the trend, you can see that's the share of student participation in STEM programs. And though it's been sort of slow-paced, there has been a steady positive trend, both in absolute levels of enrollment in STEM-aligned pathways, but then also in the total share of CTE participation in STEM over time. And that's just to kind of hammer home that schools are offering more, but then student participation has been following that in ways that, again, at least using the Massachusetts data here, should be reflected in our sort of conception of what CTE looks like and how pathways are designed into post-secondary life. So in addition to the handful of studies that I'm highlighting studies that I'm a part of because I know them, and then other recent causal evidence. But here I'll just lay out, there's a lot of CTE research being funded. And right now, this is just IES-funded research, right? So this isn't other foundation-funded work or work that's being done unfunded related to the impacts of career and technical education. And so there's, to the extent that this is, particular areas of interest, using naturally occurring lotteries and regression discontinuity opportunities. I'm working with the Research Alliance and folks at MDRC to study New York City CTE. MDRC is looking at the P-TECH model and has a preliminary report out on their website now. Julie Edmonds and Fatih Unlu are looking at early college high schools, doing some causal work in North Carolina. Beth Glennie in Florida looking at industry recognized credentials and certificates. Catherine Shields at EDC looking at career academies in California. Michael Gottfried, Daniel Classic, using some nationally representative data to look at CTE for lower income students, and then some work that I'm doing with Michael Gottfried as well, looking at the experience of students with disabilities in CTE. I mean, there's really a lot happening. These are all studies that are in progress, and some of them will start to have, like I mentioned, the P-TECH early impact findings will start to have results that I imagine will be of interest and potentially useful to you all, and should be becoming available shortly. But I also mentioned this just to say that I think there's going to be a lot more evidence in short order, and then hopefully more to build from in thinking about positioning practice and policy. So I'll just throw out a few other areas for that I think are ripe for future research. Anytime there's a big policy shift or change in how students are getting access to CTE, there's sort of natural experiments, and I lay out some some examples of that, but I'll just highlight one here that I'm in the midst of working with the state of Kentucky to understand. They're rolling out career academies district-wide in Jefferson County in ways that mirror what Metro Nashville Public Schools did about a decade ago. I think these are the only two large districts that I know of that have taken this approach to rolling out career academies, but both really create nice opportunities for some quasi-experimental evaluation. And so I'm hoping we'll have some evidence there soon, but things like that are ripe opportunities, I think. And the state longitudinal data systems, that infrastructure has been invested in over the last decade and a half by the federal government. And I think to the extent that folks like NAF can make connections, research connections to access those state longitudinal data systems, there's a lot to be learned. And then, of course, I mentioned, and several of you asked rightly about, really understanding what's under the hood and how CTE works and for whom. And to do that, we need, to see under what conditions these effects are generated, which means we need a lot more information on mechanisms. And so, finding ways of doing that should be the focus of future work. And the CTE Research Network will have a few sort of working papers out soon, throwing out ideas for how to do that, some of which might align nicely with some of the work of NAF. And so again, by way of Nick and the CTE Research Network website, I'll make sure that we share that. And I think that there's still a lot to be learned about the CTE teacher workforce. I want to make sure that I leave some more time for questions so I can come back to this if people are interested. But the short of it is, though CTE teachers comprise only about 10% of all high school teachers, they have higher than average turnover. And the barriers to entry, are more substantial, especially in high demand fields like health services and IT, where competition to private sector employment is quite high. So I think there's a lot to be done there. I've gone backwards. Okay, so this is just another. I've reinserted the same slide on the research network. So maybe I'll sort of pause on that and leave some space for questions and conversation. I see that one other question just popped in. I'm
going to try to work to getting you on the screen, but go ahead. Yeah, there's a question coming in from Phyllis. Yes.
So about developing career institutes as a new pathway. So I'd love to hear some more about this idea of wall-to-wall schools. It sounds maybe like it's similar to these Connecticut technical high schools that we're studying, where every student in the school is pursuing at least one CTE program of study and will be a concentrator in at least one area. And the idea is that everybody who's enrolled in this school is a CTE concentrator, but that maybe there are between 10 and 16 different programs of study offered at the high school. And at least in the Connecticut model, in some similar schools in New York City, and then some other schools in Massachusetts that I've worked with to study, what they do is in 9th grade, students who are admitted do a test drive basically of between 3 and 6 different programs of study, and they spend sort of equal units of time across the whole school year progressing through these 3 to 6 different programs. And at the end of the year, they rank their preferred programs, and then the teachers do some evaluations of students as they go through those programs, and they rate what they see as the student's greatest strength and best fit, and then in 10th through 12th grade, they're matched with one of those programs, and then they spend all of their sort of elective coursework in those programs of study in grades 10 through 12, having made a more informed choice at the end of 9th grade. So I'm not sure, Phyllis, if that sounds like it might align with the idea of the career institutes. But this idea of being able to do sort of like whole school CTE, where work-based learning and mentoring and workforce exposure and trying on different pathways, certainly it's one of the spaces where we have the best evidence to date about CTE impact. but it's also a place where we sort of don't know what part of that experience drives the effects that we see.
Kind of piggybacking off that question, if more questions are coming in, please do submit them. But I had a question. Is there anything you've come across in any of your research that you might just recommend to schools? That might be some low-hanging fruit that they may not already be doing, or could do very easily, that might be feasible and fundable and may lead to some nice impacts for their students.
So one idea, so the whole school models of CTE are obviously a really large investment and potentially really expensive. So the opposite of what you're asking about. But so I'm constantly thinking about exactly what you asked, like how might we adopt pieces of the things that we know work in low cost ways to more generalizable settings. And one thought I have is, when I was a high school teacher and administrator, if a student said, I think I might be interested in this, but I don't really know, right? The challenge in the way most high schools are set up is you have to pick a course and commit to that course for the whole year, or at least the whole semester. And so you're only getting exposed to that one thing during that time period. And if schools could set up either semester-long courses or year-long courses where students got exposed to a breadth of possible elective courses to give them a sample of experiences, to me, that might lead then in grades 10 through 12 to just much more informed course taking, right? And better path setting through high school and onto the post-secondary environment. Because asking students to make these year-long commitments or semester-long commitments and then still giving them just a narrow exposure means we're really limiting, right, how much they can learn about themselves and their own interests in a short period of time. The other piece I would say is, to the extent possible, once students are in a particular pathway, to the extent that you can create multi-year mentorships between students and teachers. Is another area that through maybe some deliberate scheduling, you could leverage those personal connections in ways that could show benefits.
That's great, thank you. Another question here came in. Is there any evidence about what specific individual practices are driving stronger student outcomes?
So the short answer is not maybe what we would hope, right? In terms of being like really specific and actionable. That said, in the Connecticut study, it's a big enough study, and we have enough administrative data that we can start to account for some of the factors, right? So related to Phyllis's question about these like career institutes or whole school models where there's a lot of different CTE programming offered, one question we had was just having more choices, so that if you get into the technical high school, you have like 14 programs of study to choose from. But if you stay at your residential high school, you're going to have like 2 programs of study. So that's a pretty strong contrast. And so we were able to say that the number of programs you have to choose from does account for some of the positive impact, but only about 1/5 of it. Right, so 20% of the overall impact can be explained by having more choices, but that leaves 80% of the impact unexplained. Another place where we were able to get a little traction is you might imagine that another way that earnings could be benefited from CTE is just that you learn something that helps you sort into industries of employment that pay better on average than the other industries that you might have joined had you not gone to the technical high school. So if we control for what industry employs you after high school, we also still find that explains only a small fraction of the total impact, right? Which leads us to believe that the other experiences you're having are actually making you a better employee, or you have additional skills that you wouldn't have had if you didn't get into that high school. And so, maybe some of it is about making better employment choices or more informed employment choices, and maybe some of it is about having more curricular opportunities, but neither of those is telling the whole story. which then leaves us with other elements of this whole school experience, which is like, getting to test drive things in 9th grade, having multi-year mentoring models, having all of your peers be in CTE. And those are the pieces, the practices and aspects of the experience that we can't partial out.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say that's an issue everywhere. I know, kind of parsing out what is having the most impact. Is it a whole experience, or are different pieces coming together? Do they have to be together? Yeah, it's an ongoing issue right now.
And so, like, to speak to that's been part of our ongoing collaborative conversation through the CTE Research Network. And so just in the last couple of days, we've been with a few of these working papers that we plan to put out soon, been talking about like what are the methods we could use? What tools do we have at our disposal that might allow us to design interventions and evaluations that would help us get at some of these pieces? And so, I think that there's been some really fruitful conversation and some really clever folks who know methods that are less familiar to me that we're going to try, are going to help bring this to the fore. And then hopefully, moving forward, we could start to adopt some of these models and maybe implement them in ways that'll get a better answer to that question.
As you know, Dr. Dougherty, here at NAF, we not only work with great schools and the staff that are in those schools, but we also work with a number of great employer partners who are also asking what they could do to help some of these efforts. What's the research like about employment partner and their participation? What does it say anything, or is that a pressing need?
So we don't know definitively. I can mention in the New York City study that we're doing right now, we're collecting a bunch of data on program components, including the number of post-secondary partners and employer partners that are associated with a program of study, and trying to get a better handle on the extent to which that can help explain the impacts of programs. In Massachusetts, programs have an additional potential level of like quality designation. It's called Chapter 74 program approval. And that particular language just comes from the state statute that provides the funding for these additional funds. But what it means practically is that in order for the state to give your program of study this additional certification and funding, you have to demonstrate that you've got a advisory board that includes employers, that includes organized labor, since Massachusetts is a union, a state that allows collective bargaining, other like workforce investment boards, other local stakeholders, right? And that all of those stakeholders are a part of informing your curricular choices, your equipment choices, and the like size and focus of your programs of study. And I can say in Massachusetts, we're starting to find some evidence that programs that have that designation, and so then have those explicit partners that provide input, seem to result in better outcomes on average for students in them. So if we took like an auto mechanics program that was Chapter 74 approved, and another one that was not, meaning that the former, has those partners in place, we do see that on average students have better sort of employment and post-secondary outcomes. And so, again, not conclusive, but there is increasingly suggestive evidence that having quality partnerships matters.
Yeah, and then especially mapping out those partnerships ahead of time too, right?
Yeah, I think, anecdotally and having conversations with particular programs, you do hear anecdotes that sort of align with what my prior assumption was, which is when people are making like deliberate and frequent contact and are really leveraging expertise and access. It's the experiences and outcomes are better than where it's sort of just like nominally a partner.
Sure. Looks like we have another question in here. It says, this is from Mo Miller. It says, we have career academies school-wide. Every incoming 9th grader is placed in a pathway. We are now looking at our data and will make changes accordingly. Okay, so that's a little less of a question and more, yeah, to your point, what you were saying about having students experience, have a toe in the water everywhere, so to speak, during 9th grade.
Yeah, and I don't know enough about the school-wide academy model. I'm in the process of working with some grad students to try and do a retrospective evaluation of the rollout of the career academies in Nashville public schools, in Metro Nashville. But one of the questions I have is exactly that, about how common it is for schools that have wall-to-wall academies for them to have a trial run. Right, or some sort of multi-academy exposure in grade 9. And I think places really, in my experience or from conversations, really vary in their approach to that. Maybe not so much within Metro Nashville, but across the country, places that I've spoken to that have academies. There are different processes that kind of determine who's in what academy at what point and how easy it is to change. And so I think, yeah, looking at the data is exactly the way to go, because again, we don't know a whole lot about the efficacy of one particular model over the other.
Okay. We're wrapping up, so if anyone has a last minute question, go ahead and submit it now. But I just wanted to, in the meantime, thank Dr. Dougherty for his time and his insights. We're really thrilled about the research you're conducting and about what's coming next from you. So how can people from the NAF network or NAF staff, if they want to stay up to date on what you're doing, how can they do that? Is it through Vanderbilt's website, or do you have a Twitter account? Or
so I do have a Twitter account. I mean, you can feel free to email me at my Vanderbilt email address. I did not put my Twitter handle on here. That's something I should improve. But if you search with my first and last name on Twitter, there's a musician with the same spelling, and I am decidedly not that person. I don't think I'm creative enough. But it should be pretty easy to find. Also, any working papers I'll have linked through the CTE Research Network, and we'll be sharing via Twitter as well. But feel free to be in touch. I'm pretty good about turning around replies in most cases on email within a few days, as long as I'm not on vacation when the emails come in. And then it might take me a little while.
Okay. It looks like we have one last question here from Wendy. Have you ever explored effective domain initiatives that contribute to successful programs?
So I've not. I mean, I think that there's good reason to have hypotheses about sort of, the affective changes in student behavior or thinking about kind of job readiness skills, learning how to interact, different communication strategies and skill development. I mean, the short answer for why I haven't done that to date is that it would take a prospective affirmative intervention as opposed to leveraging administrative data, and so it's just a lot more time consuming and expensive to do. And while I do get some, or have been successful in getting some money from IES, that typically would take a larger pool and a very willing partner. So if you know of any willing partners, it's something that I think is immensely needed in the field, and to better understand sort of the mechanisms through which all schooling experiences might benefit you. And so no is the short answer, but I think that there's a great need for it, and some of that need could be met through fruitful partnerships, for sure.
All right. I'm going to end this here with just another really quick announcement. So thank you again to everyone who stopped by and was engaging Dr. Shaun Dougherty here and taking in his insights. We hope you walked away with something new, a new perspective or some new knowledge, or maybe just a new idea for yourself. I wanted to give everyone a heads up that our next talk is actually going to be scheduled for September 14th at 2 p.m. Eastern again. So keep an eye on your email for that. Actually, our next speaker, Dr. Catherine Shields, was actually one of the folks cited by Shaun in one of the previous slides from Education Development Center. So as I mentioned, keep an eye on that, and for the details in the RSVP. And thank you again, Dr. Dougherty, for joining us today and for sharing your knowledge. We really appreciate it. And for everyone else, take care and stay safe.